Hello, Earthlings, and welcome along to another time tunnel. It used to be called Roger's time tunnel. I think I might call it Roger and Ruger's time tunnel, because usually this is about the time when my cat companion wakes up, and usually it has to have a bit of a chat in the background. So I might start calling ourselves that. So we're up to number 5 now in our new archive, the Vegan Time Tunnel. So the idea is to produce an archive of some historical moments in the animal advocacy movement, and it will be a kind of permanent record there for people to look through, because it's important to know the movement, the history of the movement that you join. It's a very, very important thing. In fact, we've already got 5 little videos. Because the first one is an intro, and I actually talked about Faye Funnel in that, and she was one of the people who burnt a fur coat. She kind of queued outside, I think it was Harrods in London, bought a fur coat which was really, really reduced, and then promptly went out and burnt it as a kind of publicity thing. And then the first one proper is the anti-vivisection movement in Britain. So that's number 1. You can find all these on my YouTube channel. And if you're not on my YouTube channel but watching this now, that's the best place to be for the chat as well. So all of this archive, if you go to playlist and you look for Vegan Time Tunnel, you'll find all these there. The first one was the anti-vivisection movement in Britain. And then the second one was the groundbreaking film from 1981 called The Animals Film, which I always describe as my generation's Earthlings. So that was number 2. Then we had a famous raid on a laboratory called Operation Valentine, because it took place on Valentine's Day, again 1982. And then the last one was the origins of the vegan social movement, when the Vegetarian Society became pregnant with non-dairy vegetarians. And after a very, very, very long gestation period, they gave birth to the Vegan Society, so that's an interesting kind of story. So we're back to anti-vivisection this time, and we're also still back to just change this. There you go. We're also back to the 80s, really. But as a general point, it seems that whenever animal advocates go into, or even other people, like film companies, go into a vivisection laboratory, or even like just an animal holding unit, they end up with some pretty horrible footage, or at least potentially. So, for example, I can think of a few. I just kind of put a list together today. I was thinking of 1981 Huntingdon Life Science, which was the prompted the Shack campaign. We'll probably have a time tunnel on that. Were exposed by an activist called Sarah Kite. She worked for the BYV at the time. That's the British Union for the Abolition of Vivisection. And so she worked undercover for a few weeks. She started off, I think, in the animal house, caring for rats first and then dogs. In the early 1980s, I was too lazy to really find out exactly. The NAL, the Northern Animal Liberation League, they entered the laboratories at Babraham, which was in Cambridgeshire. And that's when they found a cannula or a fistula in a cow. I think it might be one of the first times when people saw that big hole that they put in the side of a cow so they can look at the digestion system, this kind of thing. 1984, we had the SEAL, which is a Southeast Animal Liberation League, and they entered the Royal College of Surgeons. And in the first one, I think, I showed you a front page, I think, from the Liberator magazine, and it had a scene from that raid. And it was when the vivisector had tattooed the word crap, C-R-A-P, on the forehead of a monkey. Then 84, we had Hazleton. I was a co-founder of this thing called the Hazleton Action Group. So we'll have a time tunnel about that. And we entered the laboratory and got some documents out, and found that they were doing experiments on rats and New Zealand white rabbits, the favorite rabbit of choice in the vivisection industry, and they were researching on paraquat, although the toxicity of paraquat was already known. And then 1996 to 1997, Zoe Broughton, she filmed again in Hunting the Life Science, and that ended up on a Channel 4 documentary called It's a Dog's Life. And then finally, just this little rundown of the history of these kind of exposés, 2021 in Madrid, a Madrid-based contract research organization, which is called Vivotecnia, conducted experiments on a wide range of other animals, including monkeys, dogs, mini pigs. Mini pigs seem to have become quite popular with vivisectors in recent years. Rats, mice, and rabbits. And that expose was done by Cruelty Free International, which is the new name for the BYV. Okay, so moving on to what we're going to do today then. The time frame for this time tunnel is the early 80s, but this time it's in North America. It's again an expose of a vivisection lab, or the vivisection industry, whatever you want to say, but it's got an unusual twist to it. In terms of the context to all of this, because we're looking in particular at 1983 to 1985, the context is that Tom Reagan had just published The Case for Animal Rights, which is a groundbreaking rights-based text. So basically, we're talking about the origins of rights-based animal rights there. Gary Francione, a legal scholar, we'll meet him later in the story, was still in the animal movement. He's since left and formed a counter movement. He was working at the time for a small, young radical group by the name of People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. The ALF, the Animal Liberation Front, was arguably at the peak of its powers in the 1980s. So it was kind of like all happening, if you like. And in terms of the story for today, the ALF and PETA play a huge role. Okay, so in either May or June 84, and the date is disputed, different sources, the most powerful anti-vivisection film of all time, in my opinion, was stolen. Now, that sounds a bit odd, but that's the unusual twist about this particular story. The film was stolen rather than made, sort of. So it was, we'll come back to the made part because that is part of the controversy about all this. Anyway, what happened at the beginning is May, June 84, the ALF enter the labs of Pennsylvania University. They engage in some economic sabotage, but more significantly, they remove over 60 hours of videotape from the lab. In fact, there are some reports that it was a mixture of video and audio tape, but it was a video that we ended up being able to see, as it were. Now, the video, this is what makes this, in my view, the most powerful anti-vivisection film ever. And it probably will always be so because of this fact. The video was shot by the vivisectors, the animal experimenters. So they were filming themselves experimenting on baboons in a head injury clinic. And it's clear from what they do on film and what they say, probably even more so, that this video was never meant to be seen by the public. They were just filming it for their own archive, if you like. So without the actions of the ALF, the public will never have seen the film, even though they were paying for it. And also a huge chunk, according to the subsequent video that we're going to have a little look at, a very small part of it, which we're talking about $1 million per year was being given to this lab. Oh, and so it ended up being something like $13–14 million. And in the early 80s, that is a lot of money. So the Animal Liberation Front give PETA the videotapes, and PETA released less than 30 minutes of the 60 hours under the name Unnecessary Fuss. So that fact, it creates controversy, which we will return to a little later. Peter tended to kind of spread this around all over the world when they edited it down, and we in Britain had received a copy. And in Britain, and maybe more widely in Europe, we called it Pennsylvania Primates, but the official title of the video from Peter was Unnecessary Fuss. It's still available on YouTube. It's about 28 minutes long. It's hard to watch. So the edited version that I'm going to show you, I've been very careful about what I've chosen, and I've kind of covered over some of the scenes, if you like. So I've made this edit of about 4 minutes. So it's not graphic, but there is a content warning in the sense that you will hear the audio, which is really interesting, but also the audio itself kind of paints a picture, if you like. So I will give you a warning again when we come to it, which is going to be towards the end, really. So what made the video pretty explosive is this disgusting attitude of the vivisectors, as well as obviously what they were doing to the other animals, but their actual attitude to their animals was really kind of revealing, and begs the question about, you know, to what extent does that type of thing go on now? Because one thing that is definitely true is that you can guarantee that vivisectors are probably a lot more careful about what they do with the films that they film for themselves now than they did then. Was that something about Francione? No. It's not that he's against animal rights. In fact, quite the opposite. He would say that our movement, the one that, you know, that we're talking about, the animal movement, as he calls it, is really an animal welfare movement. He would call us animal welfarists, and that he's really the animal rights movement. And so rather than stay within the animal welfare movement, he went to separate it out to the abolitionist approach. So he would say he's animal rights, we're animal welfare. Of course, we would disagree with that, but that's the position that we're in. Okay, so I'm only going to give you the barest description of the vivisection that's going on. It was a head injury clinic, and the researchers were cementing with something called dental stone the heads of baboons into helmets. And then once they were in these helmets, then they were placed into a device, and that device jerked the heads of the apes so fast that brain damage was the likely result. After that, the researchers had the job of removing the helmets, and this becomes a real part of the controversy of all this. They resorted to using hammers and screwdrivers to do it, and so from a scientific point of view, that probably invalidates the data. So if you're thinking, well, that doesn't sound too scientific, you would be right. In fact, the procedures in this lab throughout, and also it was described as one of the best in the world, are absolutely awful. And it begs the question again, what goes on in more modern day labs? I think some apologists or supporters of vivisection will say, well, a university lab is one thing, and that was what this was, compared with the commercial one where the standards are possibly higher. So that might be one of the points that they would make. So the research in this case in Pennsylvania was claimed to be about helping humans who had suffered whiplash. So that's what they were researching on. And so Wikipedia says this: one sequence shows that a baboon's ear had been damaged as the helmet is removed. Quote, like I left a bit of the ear behind, unquote. The footage shows researchers performing electrocautery on an inadequately sedated baboon, smoking cigarettes and pipes during surgery, laughing and playing loud music. A researcher is seen holding a brain-injured baboon up to the camera, while another speaks to the animal. quote, "Don't be shy now, sir, nothing to be afraid of." While one baboon is strapped and waiting in the hydraulic device, the photographer pans to a brain-damaged baboon strapped into a high chair in another corner of the room, and he says, quote, "Cheerleading is the corner. We have B10. B10 wishes his counterpart well. As you can see, B10 is still alive. B10 is hoping for a good result." Now, that last part, which showed in the film that there was more than one baboon under experimentation, becomes very important in the subsequent controversy about all this. So as you can imagine then, by the time we get to the autumn of '84, the goings on at this university had been exposed, and perhaps unsurprisingly, it became big news. Now, I'm going to just jump a little bit forward to 1985 now, and then we're going to return to watch a little bit of the film, but also to talk about the controversy about when the video was released. So on July the 15th, 1985, about 100 animal activists, including Professor Tom Regan, the author of The Case for Animal Rights, occupied the office of the National Institute of Health. This is in Bethesda in Maryland in North America. The protesters demand that the government should at least suspend the funding to this research, but really they were demanding a full investigation. As usual, the police threatened immediate arrests, but in the end, there was a standoff for about 4 days when it was a 4-day occupation. So Gary Francione, the animal rights legal scholar, and he was there, in fact, he was everyone's lawyer, including Tom Regan, really. He says that Tom Regan essentially kept things going over this period of 4 days because the activists were tired, they became anxious, and they also became frightened because they're under constant fear of arrest and also what violence might be used while they were being arrested, that kind of thing. Francione reports that Reagan was a calming influence, recounting to the activists the history of non-violent protest in general in lots of different social movements. Reagan said that such social movements had their place, and this was exactly the same. So this kind of non-violence resistance had its place within our movement, just as it had in others. So there is a special on Tom Regan in a journal called Between the Species, which you can find. And Francione's got an article in that, and it's called Reflections on Tom Regan and the Animal Rights Movement That Once Was. Now, that again is an indication to why he left, because he says that it's no longer the animal rights movement. He says this, quote, "Tom was a terrific storyteller, and his tales and his knowledge of social justice movements engaged and energized this group day after day for almost 4 days straight." So eventually, Margaret Heckler, who was the Secretary of Health and Human Services, announced the suspension of the lab's $1 million annual grant. And she also did, in fact, order this full investigation, which is what they really wanted. And Francione again says, quote, "This sitting was undoubtedly the most significant event that had happened to date, and perhaps since, in the American animal rights movement." So the lab was closed down, people were fired, and then there was some reconstruction going on. In other words, that it's quite likely that some of the vivisection would have been transferred elsewhere. They might have swapped species, which is often what they will do as a result of these kind of campaigns. And so the chances are that the vivisection continues in some modified form, which is one of the problems about pressure campaigns. So the legacy of this entire thing, in my mind, is the actual film. And as I said, it can still be seen on YouTube in all its 28-minute glory. So I want to then look at this kind of propaganda war that broke out after the release of the video. there were concerns, for example, that Peter had released only 28 minutes from 60 hours of stolen videotapes. Worse, there was a claim that Peter used clever editing techniques to show the same baboons several times, claiming that we see many baboons. So enter into the story something called the Office for Protection from Research Risks, which is OPRR. And OPRR came into existence officially in 1972. This group completely blasted Peter with lots of allegations of tampering with the raw video materials, distortion, and lying. But the interesting thing about that, when I've looked at it, is that their own stance seems pretty replete with misrepresentations itself. So there was a kind of battle going on. So I'm going to show you a document, which is this one. And let's just zoom to the top. You'll see this is reflections on the organizational locus of this OPRR. And it's written by someone who used to run it for many years. And he's called Charles Raymond McCarthy. And in fact, his little blurb says, because this was in an obituary actually, Charlie was OPRR's longest-serving director, holding the role during the critical period of 1977 to 1993. So in other words, he was the director whilst this happens, and he wrote this report about what happened with Peter. In fact, this report is full of Peter stuff. But then this is the interesting thing. He said, in that role, he was charged with protecting the rights of human subjects and promoting the welfare of laboratory animals. So right there, we can see a problem. The humans are the ones with the rights, and any vague idea of rights for other animals is rights to welfare, which is not really animal rights. So that's an interesting one. So going back to this document then, just scroll down, and we need endnote 32, I think. It's all picked out already. That's good. This is about Blue Peter. For those people who are not British, Blue Peter is a long-running children's program, and they used to make things there and then on the screen, but they used to do some shortcuts and say, "Well, here's one I made earlier." So this is one that I highlighted earlier. So I'm just going to zip through what's been said here because this tells us a lot about what's to come in terms of the video that I'm going to show you. In 1983, another case made national headlines. A group that identified themselves as the Animal Liberation Front, ALF, broke into the University of Pennsylvania head injury clinic in Philadelphia. Equipment was smashed and files were scattered. Most importantly, approximately 60 hours of video and audio tapes were stolen. The tapes had been used as a tool by research investigators to capture visual images of research animals. Data concerning heartbeat, blood pressure, and brain wave activity. And this becomes quite important, this last little bit. And investigators' verbal observations concerning the animals involved in the research study of head injuries. The protocol called for sedated baboons to be injured in a machine that simulated the whiplash motion that often inflicts damage to the neck and spine of humans involved in rear-end auto crashes. The nature of the injuries to the animals were to be studied, and the animals' unassisted recovery from injury was to be compared with the recovery of animals that received a variety of treatment modalities. The protocol was controversial because it requires the infliction of severe injuries to the baboons. Each animal ultimately would be examined in terminal surgery. The ALF gave the stolen audio videotapes to Peter. Peter edited the tapes added a voiceover commentary and circulated the edited tape entitled Unnecessary Fuss to schools, newspapers, Congress, television networks, and dozens of television stations. Congress and members of the general public were shocked at the cruelty to and disregard for the research animals presented on the tape. Peter then petitioned the PHS, I'm not quite sure what that is. I thought it meant Pennsylvania Health Service, but it doesn't, to close the labs and to punish the investigators, Doctors Langfit and Generelli, for violations of the PHS policy. OPRR refused to act on the basis of evidence contained in an edited tape. The University of Pennsylvania claimed that Unnecessary Fuss was a caricature of the actual proceedings that had taken place in the laboratory. Peter refused for more than a year to turn over the evidence it had to the OPRR. In the spring of 1984, Peter sent the unedited tapes to the USDA, which in turn sent them to the OPRR, the group that this guy works for. OPRR asked 18 veterinarians, mostly diplomats, diplomats of the American College of Laboratory Animal Medicine, who were, for the most part, employed in various institutes within NIH, to review the tapes and report on their findings concerning violations of the PHS policy or the American or the Animal Welfare Act. In the meantime, OPRR conducted several site visits to the head injury laboratory. On the last of these site visits, Dr. Generelli performed a surgical procedure in the presence of the visitors, which he claimed was typical of those involved in the study. OPRR was astonished to learn that aseptic technique was sloppy, that smoking was allowed in the operating theatre, improper on many grounds, and dangerous procedure when oxygen tanks were stored and used, and that the depth of induced anesthetic coma in the animals was questionable. OPRR also learned that most of the animals were not seen by the attending veterinarian either prior to or after suffering whiplash. The final paragraph. OPRR discovered that the Unnecessary Fuss presented the case history of only one of the approximately 150 animals that had received whiplash. By clever editing and inaccurate voiceover comments, the viewer was led to believe that the inhumane treatment depicted on the film was repeated over and over and over again. In actual fact, one baboon was badly treated, and the film showed that single mistreatment over and over again, while the commentary or the commentator narrated that the mistreatment was repeated over a long series of different animals. In all, OPRR identified about 25 errors in the description of what was taking part. Typical was the statement accompanying the film showing an accidental water spill, that acid had been carelessly poured on a baboon. Okay, so that's a fairly damaging attack on Peter, if you like. So I'm just going to show you now my edits, and once again, a bit of a content warning. I've taken out all the graphic imagery, so you shouldn't see much, but you will hear them talking. Now, this is what to look out for. First of all, you see the title. Then you see a statement by this researcher Generelli, the kind of leader of the pack, if you like. This is where the title came from, because he talked about unnecessary fuss. Then we hear an intro by Ingrid Newkirk. In fact, she mentions rock music, So rock music does appear in the full film, but I've edited it out. So even though it mentions rock music, you don't hear it, but it is there. Sloppy practices leading to injuries. So this is the controversy about whether acid was spilt or not. Then you've got Dr. Torg, and he's talking about how easy it is to damage a brain. And this is where you get the issue about the hammer and screwdriver being used. So you got Newkirk talking about that. The fact that it was not sterile was an issue, that smoking was involved, as it said in that report, violations of regulations and the law. Researchers then called an injured baboon a sucker. And then Langfit, in a press statement about laughing, said that the researchers wouldn't laugh at the apes, and then this is totally contradicted by the film. One of the vivisectors called one of the baboons a punk, and there's a little bit of flirting going on really between the guys and a female research technician, I think. And the real problem here was that she was holding the baboon, but he was brain damaged, and so his head kept tilting back. And so she was cracking jokes about he wanted a kiss and this kind of stuff. As a general matter, in terms of PETA, you'll see that there's a lot of emphasis on the fact that they broke laws and regulations. So you start to see how PETA kind of moved towards a kind of animal welfare stance, even as early as '85, which is quite interesting in that. So those are the things that you're about, as it were, to see. So let's see if we can get on with it.
In the next few minutes, you will see practices defended by the University of Pennsylvania, where experimenters inflict repeated head injuries in baboons. What you are about to see and hear is all footage the animal researchers took themselves. It offers only a glimpse of what the taxpayer pays for but is never allowed to see. Aside from my voice, the voices you will hear belong to the experimenters themselves. The rock music is theirs.
Why don't you put him in the fucking goddamn cage?
I'm working on it. I'm trying to get, would you cut this? I'm trying to cut this thing. What was it?
This federally funded head injury clinic receives approximately $1 million tax dollars every year and is now in its 13th year. Some animals receive up to 160 hammer blows at a time, yet the delivery of these extra blows is not revealed in the researchers' grant applications. In violation of the NIH guide, experimenters in this laboratory repeatedly fail to perform sterile surgery. Although this researcher is wearing gloves, the surgery can in no way be considered sterile, as no mask, gown, cap, or surgical drapes are used, and the researcher not only rests his surgical instrument on the baboon's unshaven chest, but places the instrument back in the baboon's head after he drops it to the floor. Again, in violation of the NIH guide, these experimenters smoke continually at the operating table. These experimenters are also violating Pennsylvania state law, which prohibits smoking in the vicinity of bottled oxygen and nitrous oxide, both highly dangerous gases in use in this room. While the experimenter on the far side of the table lights up a cigarette, the student working on the monkey comments that he has 3 months to learn neurosurgery.
Good job. You gotta stop eating boards. Huh? You gotta stop eating boards, jeez. You gotta learn all this shit all over again.
Oh, have some axonal damage though, monkey, else we're wasting $500 worth of HRP on you. That's right, you sucker. years.
She doesn't look the least bit
There she goes. There she goes. She's on TV,
Oh, God.
holding her monkey.
Look, yeah.
No, go.
Like a cat. Can you look at the cat commercial?
Say over here. Say cheese.
Looks like she's gonna fall in.
Here.
You better hook the anti-vivisection people don't get a hold of this film.
The who?
The anti-vivisection people, they get a nice shot of you.
Why don't you
You got Larry's name
for
in the picture.
Karen? Get that part on the pan.
Right.
So funny about
Has the punk look.
the conquest, is that what you said?
You're gonna rescue me from this, aren't you? Aren't you?
Okay, so those bits there about the only kind of fairly non-graphic parts of the film that I extracted out for this purpose. Just wanted to go back to a couple of things that that was said in that report. For example, typical was the statement accompanying the film showing an accidental water spill that acid had been carelessly poured on a baboon. I read that out before badly. I've always been terrible at reading out loud. What Newkirk actually says in the film is that poor handling results in a fluid, perhaps acid, being spilt on an animal. So whether you think that that was totally misleading, and I suppose it puts into the viewer the mind that it could have been acid. But then again, we are talking about a laboratory here, so there is that. Also, he says that in all, OPRR identify about 25 errors in the description of what was taking place. Now, I'm not actually quite sure that there's enough narration for that to even taken place, really. So that's one issue, as it were, in defense of Newkirk and Peter. And then finally on this, it said that the idea was to capture visual images of research animals, data concerning heartbeat, blood pressure, and brain wave activity, and investigated verbal observations concerning the animals involved, blah, blah, blah. So again, I'll let you decide whether what was going on there was just simply the investigators' verbal observations about what was going on in terms of the research. There's quite a lot of really weird stuff going on. For example, researchers lifting baboons or a baboon by the arms, and then later saying that he thinks that the baboon has likely got a shoulder dislocation. So there's a lot of kind of weird, very unscientific stuff going on. Oh, and BC, PHS, Public Health Services, thank you for that. Either way, it's bad lab practice to have unlabeled liquid lying around the place, enforcing the argument that a GLP was not followed. The thing about that, I suppose, is that because it was off, you couldn't actually see what was going on. It could have been a tap rather than a bottle of liquid. So that, but again, see, this is where you get into the interesting kind of welfare rights thing, because the one worrying part of a necessary self fuss is the fact that there is a suggestion that it wouldn't be so bad if all the regulations, the laws were being upheld. this is the same problem that we have in the movement at the moment, when activists concentrate on things like whether a particular farm is living up to its high welfare standards. Obviously, from an animal rights point of view, it's totally irrelevant whether they do or they don't, because as I said at the beginning, whenever people have gone into a laboratory, they find horrible things going on. But one thing you can guarantee in every laboratory is that you'll find routine and systematic animal rights violations. So the actual nitty-gritty, as it were, is not such a problem as the fact that they're being used. And but that's a dilemma for the anti-vivisection movement, in the sense that if you just say, well, you know, we're totally opposed to animal use, and you probably haven't really got a film then, so you've got to go through what's happening, and that inevitably you end up talking about the treatment rather than the use, and that's where I think the public can get quite confused about what's going on, and also about what we want. As abolitionists, we just want no animal use. But when we keep talking about treatment, and in particular how some farms or laboratories are not living up to the standards that they're supposed to, then that puts the focus on treatment, and then that puts the focus on reform, and then that puts the focus on welfare. And that's always the kind of danger with these things. Right, have we got any more before we split? So that was Unnecessary Fuss, Pennsylvania Primates. And to answer the question in the title, who made the most powerful anti-vivisection film ever, it was the vivisectors. And that's why I always say that, well, we're never really going to get another film as powerful as that. I mean, there are some really powerful anti-vivisection films, like Hidden Crimes, which was produced by the Hans Reusch people. Bernie V, hi. This horrific video made me an anti-vivisection activist. We need more vegans and animal rights activists to participate in anti-vivisection protests. Yes, well, obviously, that's part of what's going on in terms of the movement right now, is that there is a lot more. Some of the old-time long-term unsaboteurs and anti-vivisectionists, you know, like John Curt and Mel Broughton, those kind of people, they did suggest that vivisection had become like a forgotten issue. And funny enough, it was COVID that brought it back in that sense, because suddenly we had all the kind of debate about how the vaccines was produced, and then people then started talking about animal experimentation again. Whereas generally speaking, the movement had gone rather silent on vivisection and concentrated much more. See, I don't know whether, I mean, is there any of those kind of films that vegans recommend in the last few years, you know, Dominion, Earthlings, Land of Hope and Glory, these are, as far as I know, there's no vivisection in any of those, right? And so I'm not quite sure whether there would be, you know, is there a modern day anti-vivisection film that has been produced by the movement recently? There's a lot of vivisection in the animals film, but there wasn't any, I don't think, in Earthlings and Dominion, Land of Hope and Glory, all the kind of videos that we tend to recommend to non-vegans in terms of go vegan, right? John Hopkins, owl experiments more recently, as in an expose or a film of? Yeah, Joanna's reminding people about the ongoing controversy, which seems to be being resolved almost, well, slightly at least. It does seem that I heard a report that Apple have now suggested that there are no animal products in their devices. And one argument there is the fact that it would have to have some kind of health and safety warning about allergies on the packaging. If it was the case that if you take apart your device, you could come in contact with something that was toxic to you, that you would have an allergy to. So that's one suggestion. So, but there might be a difference between Apple and the other groups, you know, androids, and I'm not quite sure what they're all called, but it does seem now that we are getting to the stage where it looks like that particular club that non-vegans use to beat vegans with is rather diminishing. And some interesting news about the crop deaths scenario as well is the fact that well, I'm waiting on an audio of an exchange where some farmers are starting to object to people kind of castigating vegans for causing the deaths of trillions of other animals, because the farmers are saying, well, they're accusing us of that as well, because we're the ones who are doing that killing as well as the other killing. So it's not the vegans. And so it's quite an interesting kind of development, this. So it's just kind of seemed to be happening right now. And so that's going to be news for the future, I think. Right, people, thank you so much for tuning in. And we shall be back next week with another vegan time tunnel. So thanks a lot for tuning in. Hey, Earthlings, welcome, welcome, welcome to another time tunnel. So for those of you who've been here before, you'll know that we're putting together an archive of some of the kind of historical events and issues within the animal rights movement, the animal liberation movement, the animal protection movement. All of that comes into it. Today we're talking about Sea Shepherd again. So this is a kind of companion piece in a way to the first thing which I've already done, which we're talking about the action in the Orkney Islands in the north of Scotland, whereas this is talking really about the birth of the international organization. So that's what this one's about. So who's in the house? Not your mum, not your milk. Hey, Andy, how you doing? Deb, hello there. Paul Hatterley, Canadian Vegan Forever. Hello, hello. Michael's in the house. Vegan Cannibal. So how are you all doing? Thanks for coming along. So this is going to be an interesting day, because in 90 minutes from now, there is the world premiere of this excellent 27 minutes or so film from Andy Atkinson. And we're presenting that on my channel. And then as soon as that's finished, it'll go live on Andy's channel, which is Not Your Mum, Not Your Milk. So yeah, so it's going to be a busy day. But we have the time tunnel to deal with first. So welcome along, in fact, to the Vegan Time Tunnel. Yes, here we are then. So Sea Shepherd, the early years. And so in terms of the context for this, I kind of got involved with Sea Shepherd in the early years through someone called Dave McCall, who I've mentioned before, and he was, if you like, the prime mover for the Orkney campaign. So if you, again, we've already got a time tunnel on that. So if you want to look at that, it's a question of going to my YouTube channel, which you're already on, and then look for playlists, and you'll see the vegan time tunnel. Actually, I'm just going to remind people, if you're watching elsewhere, the best place to watch this is on my YouTube channel, because that's where the most active chat is. I know some people like to watch on Facebook, but this is the best place. And have no fear, people. You can comment away, and we'll address your comments, because this channel doesn't make anybody pay to talk to vegans, because I don't think that's the right thing to do. So McCall. Now, one interesting thing about Dave McCall was he was the European director of Sea Shepherd, and yet he doesn't feature much now in the history of Sea Shepherd. So don't know why that is. So I'm not going to speculate, but it's certainly true that I wouldn't say he's been totally invisibilized, but he's certainly, you know, his kind of the role he played has been reduced, let's say. So I was part of the Sea Shepherd crew for the Orkneys, and then I knew Dave McCall. I used to run an animal rights shop in Liverpool. So we talk about 1981, 82. And he used to, as part of a fundraiser for Sea Shepherd, he had all these cruelty-free vegan products called Corny. I think they were called, the brand was called Corny. So it was soaps and shampoos. And I remember neck firming cream. I remember that. And funny enough, it was very popular for some reason. And then the other connection with Dave was that we were both on the British Union for the Abolition of Vivisection Committee, which is why you've got the Brown Dog Affair book there. Now, there will be a time tunnel about the Brown Dog Affair because it's really kind of interesting. It's to do with the statue you can see in the picture there, the statue of the little brown dog. And yeah, it's an interesting story, so we'll come back to that. But the reason it links in with Dave McCall is that we were on the committee when the new statue was being talked about and brought into being. So medical students had smashed up the first statue, and then there was a move to return another version of the statue. And then the argument was, because I think it was the BUAV, the NAVS, National Anti-Vivisection Society, and I think maybe Animal Aid, all chipping in. I think the idea was for everybody to chip in £3,000. And this is 1982, so I suppose that's quite a lot of money in those days for this new statue. And every time we went down for our monthly committee meetings, I mean, Dave used to come from Scotland and I used to come from Liverpool. There'd be a big argument about what posture the dog would be in. And eventually Dave lost his temper and he said, I don't care, you know, if the dog is, you know, lying down, you know, having a poo or, you know, having a wee or anything, just let's get this done. So he kind of lost his temper about it because he was very much an activist, as you can imagine. And then another context, just to finish the contextualization bit, is the slideshow that I used to run. Now, those of a certain age will know what this picture is, and those not of a certain age probably won't. So these are slideshow projectors or slide projectors. So the one on the left is called a carousel one, and the other one is one that you just put in individual, well, you can put in 2 slides at once. So you had to have a pile. So if you've got 20 slides, you have to have a pile 1, 3, 5, 7, etc. And then you, on the other one, it'd be 2, 4, you know, that kind of thing. So you'd show a slide and then you'd change it, you'd take that one back out and replace it. And the only other problem, which everybody fell foul of, was you had to put the slides in upside down. Otherwise, it would appear upside down on the screen because it inverted. And everybody always got that wrong. So anyway, one of the first bits of activism I ever did was, I think Dave McCall must have given me a load of slides, or at least pictures that we had converted into slides. And I used to do this Sea Shepherd kind of slideshow. And so that essentially is what I'm going through with other things, of course. And it just told the story of the move of Paul Watson from Greenpeace International to founding of Sea Shepherd. That's essentially what the story was, because it's quite dramatic in a way, because Watson was actually thrown out of Greenpeace. So if we actually there's a history of Sea Shepherd by a pro-whaling organization, and so they call it Sea Shepherd's Violent History, and they say 1977. Founding member of Greenpeace International, Paul Watson, expelled from the organization after a campaign against sealing. This is Portuguese sealing, I believe, during which he threw the Sealers Club's and skins into the sea. And it's interesting, really, because if you go to the official Sea Shepherd site, it merely says 1977 April, Paul Watson and Greenpeace part ways. So that's the way it is. Watson tends to say now that he left Greenpeace, but the story that I was told, that he was expelled, and because he took a happic off a sealer, and this is a picture of that horrible thing. So this is the device by which the seals were clubbed and then hauled across the ice, and so it's called happic or hackapic, and I think you usually just call it happic. And so he's thrown out of Greenpeace International because they said that was too militant to actually disarm the sealer. And as far as I know, he took one of these things and he threw it down a blowhole in the ice so it couldn't be recovered. And so I think he was also accused of theft because of that as well. So it was, as it were, a dispute. Greenpeace were at the time, I suppose, just establishing itself. And as we know from social movement theory, once you establish yourself, you tend to moderate. So it was probably moderating at the same time as Watson did this particular action, because Watson was a founding member of Greenpeace International as well, from several years earlier. So we're up to June 77, and Paul Watson establishes something called Earth Force Environmental Society. This is in Vancouver in Canada. So this is the precursor to the Sea Shepherd Conservation Society. In 1978, the first thing he did really in campaign terms outside of Greenpeace International was a campaign in East Africa, which was under the name of Earth Force. And it was investigating elephant poaching and the ivory trade, which went on. And the search went on in terms of getting back to the sea, essentially. And so we have Sea Shepherd, who come into fruition really in 1978, September, and the Fund for Animals. If I just zip back to that picture there, you can see Paul Watson. Paul Watson is being held by an unknown human. Paul Watson's the cat. No, it's the other way around. So Paul Watson is the human in this picture, but you'll see on the funnel, Fund for Animals, right? And so they essentially funded the buying of the first Sea Shepherd boat. And really interesting as well, the RSPCA got involved as well, which sounds like an incredibly radical thing for them to do. But the Fund for Animals, the Cleveland Amory, put up the money to purchase a ship. It was a trawler for Sea Shepherd Conservation Society, and their aim was to disrupt the Canadian seal hunt. And it was that got Watson thrown out of Greenpeace International. So by December of that year, then, with more money from the RSPCA, as I said, they buy an ex-trawler that becomes Sea Shepherd 1, the very first boat. Now, I think it was Dave McCall who was instrumental in buying Sea Shepherd 1 and Sea Shepherd 2, as far as I remember. I think one may have actually been bought in Glasgow, and I think Sea Shepherd 1 was bought in a place called Hull, which is on the northern east coast of England. So now we're up to March of 79, and Sea Shepherd claimed to be the first ship to go to the ice for the purpose of protecting seals. And so up until then, I think they were mainly ferried in, essentially, by things like helicopters and everything. So this was the first time that they managed to get a boat through to the ice, and that obviously meant that they had a base then to build on, if you like. The plan was to spray the seals, which became a very popular and common thing that people did. And in fact, that was, yes, the RSPCA were much a bit different back in those days. I think that's what you're saying. So the idea was to spray the seals with indelible ink. It was organic dye, and the idea is to make the pelts commercially worthless. You know, the seals don't stay white like this for many weeks, and so there's just like this kind of couple of week window where all the kind of killing is done. And the crew managed to spray about 1,000 seals before they were arrested. And then we get to their one of their first famous actions, which was 1979 at this point. The Sea Shepherd departs from Boston to sail to Bermuda, and there they were set up and equipped to start a campaign to hunt down the infamous whaling vessel, which was called the Sierra. And in the 1970s, the Sierra was credited with almost destroying the humpback whale population in the Caribbean. So this is a very bad picture, actually, of the Sierra. It's all a bit pixelated, but that is the offending vessel. The reason the Sierra was regarded as a pirate whaler was that it operated despite an international ban on commercial whaling. Also, the pirates would break all the rules of whaling to the extent that that's important, in the sense that they would take nursing mothers, they would take calves, as well as it were, the ones they were supposed to take, and all this kind of stuff. Also, if you see up there the little ramp there, the ramp that goes down from the kind of middle of the boat to the front, that's how the crew get to the harpoon, which they use to kill the whales. And the best way to understand that, if you're interested, is there's a scene towards the end of the Star Trek film called The Voyage Home. It's the film number 4 when they go back in time, and that was to save a couple of whales. And so there's a whaler in that which is very similar to this one. So we're now up to July in 79, and the Sea Shepherd find the Sierra in Portuguese waters. And so a plan is devised. They essentially pack the front of the Sea Shepherd with concrete, and then they ram the Sierra in order to disable the pirate whaler. One interesting thing about these two pictures is the one on the right, you've got all these trademarks from Greenpeace. So even though they threw Watson out, it seems that they weren't too adverse to kind of using his actions for a bit of publicity, which was quite interesting. So the Sierra is damaged. You might be able to see a big kind of gash there in the side. And in fact, they said that when they hit the boat and then they kind of parted, you know, with the waves kind of brought them apart, they could see into the, you know, the bowels, as it were, of the Sierra, and they could see the dead whales who had been stashed in there. So the Sierra limp back into Portugal, to a Portuguese harbour, and the Sea Shepherd surrenders to the Portuguese Navy. And so there's worldwide attention on this story at the time. Portuguese authorities ruled that there would be no charges against the Sea Shepherd crew, even though they did attack this pirate whaler. And so they find out then, by the time we get to November 79, that the Sierra is being repaired. It's being repaired at the dockside in order to return to the sea. And at the same time, the Sea Shepherd boat is confiscated. And so one part of the story, although this is kind of disputed now, I think, in the official history, is that the idea was to give the Sea Shepherd to the whaling company, which was called the Sierra Trading Company, as compensation for the damage and the loss of income caused by the ramming. The official Sea Shepherd story says that the Portuguese judge in the case had been bribed in order to make that decision to hand over Sea Shepherd's boat. So on New Year's Eve of 1979, the Sea Shepherd is sunk by being scuttled, which basically means going into the lower part of the boat and releasing the valves to let the water in. and so their own crew essentially scuttled their own boat in order to prevent it from being given to the whalers. The official version says that Captain Paul Watson and Chief Engineer Peter Woof, great name, Peter Woof, scuttled the Sea Shepherd. By the time we get to 1980, the Sierra is refitted and ready to return to the oceans, and so then some action is taken on that idea. And again, the Sea Shepherd official account says that 2 men and a woman enter the black waters of Lisbon Harbour during the dead of night on February the 6th, 1980. The Sierra is scuttled without injuries to her crew, and the career of the world's most ruthless illegal whaling ship is permanently brought to an end. By the time we get to March of 1980, to prevent the Sea Shepherd returning to the seal hunt in 1980 from 1979, Watson is ordered into prison on the actual first day of this new seal hunt. So they kind of convicted him, but then held the sentence over for a year to make sure that it'd be in custody when the new seal hunt would start. So essentially, his action from the previous year was used against him to stop him doing any action in 1980. By the time we get to April, on April the 28th, the pirate ships, which were called Ibsa 1 and Ibsa 2, they are sunk in a place called Vigo, which is in Spain. And at the same time, Sea Shepherd post reward posters all over the waterfront in the Canary Islands, which was offering a 25,000 bounty on another pirate whaler called the Astrid. And so the Astrid's owners refused to sail the vessel and actually retired the vessel. Now, the interesting part about that is the fact that they were unsure that they could get a reliable crew. First of all, they might not get a crew because they were frightened of the idea that they would be sunk, and also some of the crew might be the very people themselves who were there determined to Sierra. Was the Sierra operating illegally though? Yes, it was known as a pirate whaler, and that meant that it was illegal for the reasons that I gave. So not only did it was kind of operating in times when it shouldn't, and it was also taking the types of whales that none of the whalers are supposed to do. So essentially meant that the calves, the youngsters, the adolescent whales couldn't grow up to be adults, and so that was seen as a kind of existential threat. So the Sea Shepherd was penalized for doing the job that should have been done by the authorities. Yes, in fact, that was played on very much by Watson in later years, because he actually said, he would approach a whaling boat and say, right, we are Sea Shepherd, we're ourselves pirates of the ocean, but you are illegal, so return to base. We are not the ones who are illegal, you are the ones who are illegal. And so there's quite a lot of because there was a big series about Sea Shepherd called Whale Wars, and there's, I think, quite a lot of cases where Watson would order the other side, as it were, to return to base on the grounds that Sea Shepherd was upholding the law and the whalers weren't, as it were. Okay, so we're up to September 1980, and the South African Navy sink 2 boats, the Susan and the Teresa, and these are the property of the owners of the Sierra, so it'd be that trading company again. So by the time we get to 1980, the end of, all illegal whaling operation in the Atlantic had ceased. Exactly what happened in the ensuing years, I'm not quite sure about. My kind of knowledge of Sea Shepherd is really limited to these early years. So whether it resumed again or what, I'm not actually quite sure. We would have to investigate that together. We'd have to get our Google sticks out to do that. Right. In October 1980, movie rights were sold to Warner Brothers to raise money to purchase another trawler in Britain. So the fishing trawler called St. Giles is bought and renamed Sea Shepherd 2. How do you set up a trading company if the activities are, well, that's the thing. It's some of it isn't, and so it wasn't illegal to have a whaling trading company. It's just that if some of your boats were doing illegal things, you know, I mean, it's not easy to keep your eye on a whaling boat because they can go anywhere in the world, you know. So in terms of the job of the authorities, it's very difficult. You just imagine their difficulty of actually regulating the atrocity of whaling when you're talking about they could be anywhere in the world, you know. And so that's one of the I have watched Whale Wars. It was broadcasted on Animal Planet. Yes, that's right. It's all a bit daring do, but I suppose they had to kind of they had to cater for the kind of drama of that kind of series, I suppose. Yeah. So Whale Wars was I think what, about 5 years ago, John. I'm not quite sure when it was, but I think about 5 years ago when that was big news. In terms of TV or streaming, that kind of stuff. So we've got the new Sea Shepherd 2, and the vessel is moved from Hull to Greenock in Scotland for repairs and refit. The official history suggests that the sale of the film rights was enough to buy Sea Shepherd 2, but fundraising was also involved, and especially from the British end of it. True, but I mean in regards to the demand, like was that all black market? Well, it had been a mixture. That's what I'm saying. So that's always the kind of the problem, in the sense that you know, some of their catches would be legal, presumably, and some of them not. But the authorities kind of catching them with illegal whales, and again, I suppose it's a question of how do you tell, depending on the you know the size of the whales taken. They might have been too young officially, but they might have been a similar size to the ones that they were allowed to take. I imagine it got very difficult to regulate that type of thing, like it is to regulate any type of animal use. You know, I mean, even the ones on the land, you know, in a farm setting, are difficult to regulate, as we know, because of all this high welfare nonsense that is exposed time and time again. Even though half the time it was the animal groups that wanted to bring it in the first place, and then 5 years down the line they're exposing the thing that they brought in themselves. So, but you know, to actually regulate all that at sea, as it were, and then presumably catching them once they dock as well might be a problem. And again, I don't know really. Back in those days, it could well be that the regulation about tracking them might have been different. And you could imagine now with all the satellite technology, I mean, you can even find this on the internet if you want. You can find out where all the boats are in the same way as you can find out where all the planes are. I don't suppose that technology was even available back in the day. So as I said, the official history says that the film rights were enough to buy the new boat. As far as I know, there was no film in the end. So whether they had to give the money back, I'm not quite sure. But in terms of the European branch, they did things like releasing this particular single, which I've got in my hot little sticky hands, if you can see that. So that's the single. It's on the Animus record label, which produced quite a lot of animal related things. So this is Country Joe McDonald, famous for his anti-Vietnam war song in Woodstock, of course. And it's interesting. On the back, he says, "Without our help, they will soon become extinct, the baby seals." You are a very important person to a baby seal. I wrote the song, but only you can play it. So that was a big deal. So we used to sell this in the shop, and it was also part of, if you can see that there was an album as well called Animal Tracks. It was all part of that. These kind of vinyl records were used quite a lot back in the day to fundraise for the groups. So it's called Blood on the Ice. The B-side is called Coyote, which is really good. If you want to listen to that, it's a great song. There is like a studio version, but there's also a live version. So if you go onto YouTube and put in Country Joe McDonald Coyote, you'll get it. But if you get the chance, go for the live one, because it's better than the studio one. In fact, I was on there's a kind of Irish version of Desert Island Discs, and I was on that once, and I chose that as one of my records. So it's a goodie. In other words, it's a goodie. Now, one interesting thing from the movement point of view is this, that in 2010, I was involved in this group called AR Zone, Animal Rights Zone, and we used to have interviews and chats. And this was really before everything was on video. So we used to do these kind of text chats, and then we moved to audio podcasts and this kind of stuff. And the founder of AR Zone is called Carolyn Bailey, and she was very concerned about sea life. And so she was quite matey, really, with Paul Watson. And so Watson actually requested to come on to AR Zone to do an interview. But the reason for it was quite interesting. He came on because he wanted to say to the movement that Sea Shepherd wasn't an animal rights group, which might strike some people as odd, but he wanted to underline the fact that it was a conservation society. He actually said, just look at the name, Sea Shepherd Conservation Society. So it's a marine conservation group. Then in 1917, then in 2017, in other words, 7 years later from this interview, he did another one in something called the Martine Executive, where it basically said the same thing. So this is the part of that, which is the 10 misconceptions about Sea Shepherd. And so Paul Watson was asked, is Sea Shepherd an animal rights organization? And Paul replied, some media describe Sea Shepherd as an animal rights organization. However, Sea Shepherd is not an animal rights organization. Sea Shepherd is a marine conservation organization specializing in anti-poaching activities. So going back to your question, Andy, that's what they began to call themselves, anti-poaching, and even pirates and that kind of stuff, but kind of good pirates, I suppose. This misconception may be because all Sea Shepherd ships are 100% vegan vessels. So there's some confusion here from Paul Watson, in the sense that what it really means is that the Sea Shepherd ships were 100% plant-based. If they really were 100% vegan vessels, then it would be an animal rights organization, but they weren't. And also, I think the rule about being plant-based was only relevant to when you're actually a crew member, actually on board, and actually at sea, as it were. Everything else was up for grabs, I think. They are vegan vessels for conservation and environmental reasons. And what Paul Watson would often say is the fact that they became plant-based on the grounds that that so-called cattle, so-called livestock, were starting to become one of the major predators of the sea, because fish meal was starting to be used as so-called livestock feed. And so it was on that grounds that Sea Shepherd became plant-based, not, as it were, animal rights grounds. In fact, if I just switch to this is my blog on human relations with other sentient beings. And so this is from 2015. I appeared twice on this State of the Oceans radio show. It was a very bizarre experience. And if you go to the blog and listen to it, you'll see it was very, very, very chaotic. It was the Barbie twins and Paul Watson, and then I was on there as well. And essentially, I was talking about vegan philosophy, and I was talking about the research that suggests that people who are health vegans often drop out, and people who are environmental vegans, which in the kind of vernacular, if you like, that's what Sea Shepherd are, environmental vegans, or really plant-based for environmental reasons, right? So they often drop out as well. And so Paul wasn't too happy with this research and the empirical evidence that I was giving him. And he said, well, the other animals don't care why somebody doesn't eat them. And I said, yes, that is true, but it's not, it's irrelevant to the point. The research suggests that it's the so-called ethical vegans. And of course, as we know, ethical vegans means code for vegan, right? And so it's the ethical vegans who remain vegan. That's what the research suggests. So that was my experience with the last experience I had with Paul Watson back in 2015. Okay, so that's your time tunnel, in the sense that that was the early years of Sea Shepherd. When I first started to research it, it was quite interesting, the changes that had occurred, a bit of rewriting. And as I said, the one that would concern me the most was the fact that Dave McCall hardly gets a mention now, and yet he was absolutely central to the purchasing of the 2 first boats for some of the sinking, because he was involved in some of the scuttling that was going on unofficially, but he's dead now, so it doesn't matter that we say that. And also he was just, full on kind of person, not least organizing the Orkney campaign twice. And then I think anti-seal kill in Mayo in Ireland as well. So he was a big player at my time of involvement with the Sea Shepherd. So it is a bit of a shame that he seems to be, as it were, a little bit invisibilized, if that's what's really happened. Okay, people. So in about 1 hour, we are going to have the world premiere of a brand new vegan / animal rights film, and it's absolutely wonderful. And if you could join us for that as well, that would be marvelous. In the meantime, thank you for tuning into this time tunnel. We'll be back next week. I think we're looking at attitudes to other animals next week, so we can look forward to that, hopefully. And I'll see you again. So thanks for tuning in. Hey, hello Earthlings, and welcome to yet another time tunnel. So we're putting together an archive of interesting things from the history of the animal movement, the animal protection movement, the animal advocacy movement, the animal rights movement, whatever you want to call it, the vegan animal rights movement. Just let me warn you that I've got a very bad-tempered cat on my hands today. She's not having a good day, and so she might interrupt proceedings. this thing behind me is a screen, right? And I think she's learnt now that once that comes down, she can play merry hell and get whatever she wants. And so I think I've kind of created a rod for my own back. I think I'll just have to start bringing this goddamn thing down when I'm not doing a show, just so it'll break her out of this kind of thing. Because I think she just spies it and goes, right, you've had it now. Anyway, so that might occur a little bit, but hopefully not. But in the meantime, welcome to another time tunnel. Yes, so as you can see, we're doing the Little Brown Dog, or sometimes called the Little Brown Dog Affair. Just got to open a window here that I haven't done yet, so bear with me. There we go. Jiggly pokery. This is what a bad-tempered cat does for you, folks. Puts you completely out of your comfort zone. Yeah, I feel really bad for the cat is called Ruja, which is and it's a Polish word, and Ruja was rescued from some Polish people who'd never fed her, claiming that they didn't know you had to, and so she'd essentially lived by catching spiders and flies, I think. And so I do remember when we used to kind of play this kind of catchy game with a bit of string or something, she was absolutely demon at it. You know, she would never miss. And I guess it was because of that experience of not being able to be fed. So anyway, they said that they didn't know that domesticated in Nybert's terms need to be fed. So that wasn't good. Anyway, so yeah, the vegan time tunnel, the brown dog affair. Now this particular time tunnel is chock full of politics. I've got various accounts that tell the story. There's quite a lot online, and I'll point you towards those as well as things like books and stuff. There's not a lot about the fate of the actual poor dog who was vivisected, and so in terms of a content warning, I haven't included really graphic details of what happened to this particular unfortunate dog, but there is some, you know, you do get some sense of it. So just to let you know, but I'm not going to go into chapter and verse, as it were. What we're looking at really is what was going on politically and also socially when objections by vivisectors were raised by plans to erect a statue to the dog. And so the statue ended up being a site of conflict between medical students and the police, but also a working class community, which was quite interesting. So we'll go into all that. The vivisection industry really saw the brown dog affair as a slur on their scientific credentials, and so they kind of wanted it gone, really. And the idea of having a statue in a prominent place in London to remind everybody about it was not on as far as they're concerned, and so they tried their best to do everything to get rid of it. One thing it pointed out, of course, is that what came out in the subsequent trial, which we'll go through, is the fact that they did break the welfare laws. I'm going to be bunny rabbit ears for this. Is the so-called Cruelty to Animals Act, I think 1876, I think. And so they did break some of those laws, and so again, they wouldn't have wanted it around, you know. And that one of the provisions was that you should not use other animal more than once, and that's kind of what they did. In fact, some of them even tried to make a virtue of it in a weird way. They said that repeated use spared so-called fresh other animals, and so it was a good thing to use one more time than just a single use, as it were. In fact, the first vivisector who gave evidence in the trial that we're going to hear about said that very thing. So this is a kind of fairly well-known quote from George Bernard Shaw about vivisection, and I remembered it today. I also remembered, let me just drop him out for a minute. This book here, Shaw on Vivisection, I think you can read that. This is a 1949 book, which I got from a charity shop. I did find that somebody has put this little picture there. This is George Bernard Shaw with a donkey, somewhere presumably in Ireland. And so that's quite neat. It's kind of like a weirdly shaped bookmark, maybe. But this is the bit I wanted to read from the last page of this. The last page is 64, so it's not a very long book. The vivisector, I declared, is actually that worst of scoundrels, a scoundrel on principle. For no thief or murderer attempts to justify theft or murder as such, and claims not only impunity, but respect and protection for them. Whereas the vivisector maintains that knowledge as such is so supremely sacred that in its pursuit, the professional man of science may commit the most revolting atrocities merely to satisfy his curiosity. You want to know, I said, but there are some things you ought not to know. For instance, what it feels like to see your mother boiled to death. So, as usual with Shaw, he kind of mixes a political statement with a little bit of humor, of course. So it's a great little book, and as you can see again from the thing, that was from veganposters.com. So there's quite a lot of stuff on there. Now there's also a couple of eyewitness accounts. People kind of got roped into some of the events that surround the brown dog affair. And the most special one of that is this guy here on the left. It's called Bernard Ford. So it was a book that he wrote in 1907. 08, sorry. And the other sources I'm using book-wise is Peter Mason's book, The Brown Dog Affair, and also Richard Ryder's. So I put Richard Ryder's there rather small because there's not very much in his book, The Victims of Science, about it. But obviously the Brown Dog Affair was all about it. I'm going to mention another book right at the end as well. But there's also this one, which is by Coral Lansbury. Now the title's interesting in the sense that it does encapsulate all the kind of actors, all the players involved in this saga. Women, workers, and vivisection in Edwardian England, the old brown dog. And so those are the people that came together to create this dramatic scene, if you like. So we go back to the beginning, and the time scale for this particular time tunnel is 1899 through to 1994. And in fact, in terms of what I learned just this very day, in fact, even beyond that. So we'll come back to that, but that's the main kind of time scale for now. And then we have two protagonists, the anti-vivisectionists. And so the two central figures, I suppose, to this story, apart from the unnamed brown terrier type dog, are Louise Lind Hargarfi, I think. Hang on a minute, RGV, it's called the thing. But I'm just going to call her Louise Lind because I always mess up these names. And she was also called Lizzie Lind sometimes as well. And also Lisha Sartu on the right was involved as well. They met each other in 1899 and a year later visited Paris. And because both were interested in science, they visited the Pasteur Institute. And what they witnessed there was so horrific that they both became lifelong anti-vivisectionists, especially Lizzie Lind, in terms of being an activist. And interestingly, they wanted to oppose vivisection on scientific grounds. To that end, they became students at the London School of Medicine for Women in 1902. It's now called the Royal Free. You might have heard that phrase being used. So they decided that they wanted to be able to argue scientifically with the vivisectors, and so they thought that they needed then to, to get a scientific background. The institute that they joined carried out no animal experiments, but the students there could go to what was described as medical demonstrations, which did involve animal experimentation. So they witnessed as many as 50 of these demonstrations before, these are on other animals, of course, before they quit their course a year later in 1903. But they did keep detailed notes. And immediately that they left their course, they took a manuscript of what they had seen to the National Anti-Vivisection Society, the NAVS, as we know it. And the person in charge of that was called Stephen Coleridge at the time. So Coleridge was intrigued by the accounts that they gave, and in particular, their description of one particular experiment on a dog on February 1903. So the details, as I said about the content one, the details of this poor dog's ordeal are not that important, although of course we shouldn't forget what he went through, I guess. But the fact that the dog had been vivisected more than once was the key factor. And Coleridge came to the conclusion that there'd been at least 2 infringements of the 1876 Cruelty to Animals Act had occurred by 2 vivisectors. It's interesting because when I was involved with the BUAV, which will come along to British Union for the Abolition of Vivisection, this act was being updated, like a kind of almost 100 years later. And it kind of almost like ended up being worse than this Cruelty to Animals Act, which wasn't very good in the first place. But the vivisectors themselves are these characters. We've got Dr. William Bayliss on the left and Professor Ernest Starling on the right. So these are goodies for you to cheer, and you can boo these characters if you like. Both of these were employed by the University College of London. Starling is thought to have been the first person to perform vivisection on the little brown dog. In fact, when these 2 had finished with the dog, which was months apart, they handed him over to a 3rd vivisector. And that person removed certain body parts from the dog and then killed him by stabbing him in the heart. So that's about as graphic as it gets, folks. It was too late to formally charge these people by the time that Coleridge kind of was in possession of the facts, as it were. So he decided to kind of out them at a public meeting organized by the NAVS, the National Anti-Vivisection Society, which really was their AGM. And it was attended by an estimated 2,000 to 3,000 people. Now, that in itself gives you some indication of the size of the anti-vivisection movement at the time. The NAVS, if you like, gave birth to the BUAV, British Union for the Abolition of Vivisection, because the people who started the BUAV, not least Francis Power Cobb, thought that the NAVS were a bit too moderate. So it was interesting, the fact that these kind of ex-students, if you like, went to the moderate group rather than the radical group, the BUAV. But Coleridge knew that by naming Dr. Bayliss, it was almost guaranteed to result in a court case, and that's what he was trying to provoke. The Daily News, a newspaper at the time, ran the story, and within 3 days, several other papers, both regional and national, had picked up on the story and ran it as well. Coleridge's AGM speech even resulted in questions being asked in the House of Commons. And so It obviously caused quite a stir in the press and in Parliament. And so, in a sense, Bayliss felt that he couldn't ignore it. And so, sure enough, a writ for libel and slander was issued against Coleridge on the 12th of May, 1903. And it was called Bayliss versus Coleridge, you won't be too surprised. And that began on the 11th of November, 1903, which much later on would be World Vegan Day, but that obviously wasn't that relevant at the time. One thing which was interesting is that the public gallery was packed with long queues of people every day. The trial lasted for 4 days, and the people trying to get in more than anyone else was medical students. Okay, the judge was a Lord Chief Justice, Lord Alverstone, and he started to react pretty angrily to disruptions from the medical students who were making a fuss, as it were, from the public gallery. And he reminded them that his court wasn't one of their lecture theatres. So again, slight content warning, because just in terms of what I'm about to say, but it's not as bad as before, if you like. Professor Starling was first up to give evidence. Now, he gave graphic details, which I won't repeat, about what he did to the little brown dog. And even the Lancet, which was a journal that was massively in support of vivisection, they said that Starling had technically broken the law, which, although that doesn't sound too much, it was actually quite a condemnation from the Lancet to say that about a vivisector. Lind and Chartou's account of what they witnessed was also pretty gruesome. In terms of repeated use, they said the dog already had 6 previous scars, and that was just on his abdomen. While they claimed that the dog was conscious during these procedures, Dr. Bayliss insisted that the terrier dog was unconscious for the duration. In fact, he said in court that, in fact, he complained about this. He said that the dog had been given too much anesthesia. So too much anesthetic had been used, and that had interfered with the procedure that he wanted to do on the dog, and that invalidated the results. And so that particular experiment was deemed a failure, if any can be deemed a success, of course. Lord Alverstone, in summing up, said that the shambles of science, which is this book here, so this is Lind and Chartou's account of the plight of the brown dog, and it had been published earlier that year before the trial. He described it as a hysterical book, which obviously is an interesting phrase to use in terms of men calling women that name, of course. And a Rufus Isaacs, who was Bayliss's counsel, accused the Swedish women of using sex and race to make their points in court. And he even demanded, who were these Swedish women to criticize British scientists, he said. Lind was described in court as the most ignorant person to ever enter a lecture room for medical students. This sort of reaction, in fact, was precisely the reason why Lind and Chartou wanted to become scientists themselves and tackle vivisection on scientific grounds. So they were kind of almost pioneers, you might say, for what you would now call scientific anti-vivisection, which would not make moral claims. In fact, some scientific anti-vivisectionists, like Hans Reusch, for example, they would actually criticize ideas like animal rights, because they claim that human beings are selfish, and you have to make the case that vivisection is scientifically invalid, and so therefore the humans, are in danger by doing it, not that there was any rights violations in doing it. So that is a kind of position of scientific anti-vivisectionists. I think modern day people, like, for example, at the Camp Beagle, they would probably blend the two ideas and say there is a moral issue, but also the science in vivisection is, well, dodgy, the technical term you're supposed to use. And in relation to the common male description of women, often as hysterical, they themselves were severely critical of other women who would break down in tears when describing vivisection in public. So they wanted to kind of break, if you like, that stereotype. So in terms of the result of the trial, the vivisectors won, and Coleridge was fined heavily. In today's money, to the tune of £250,000, which I have translated for everyone. So that's 288,000 euros. It's 278 North American dollars. And for some reason, it's 420,000 Canadian dollars. So I'm not quite sure why that disparity there. But that's what I found when I looked at it. One newspaper reported on the medical students' gallant fight with women, as they put it. And so there was a lot going on, not just, if you like, the vivisection. The trial ended at 6 p.m. and it's reported that at 10 p.m. the very next morning, Bayliss's solicitor turned up to get the money from Coleridge. And Bayliss announced, of course, that he would donate it all to vivisection, to kind of twist the knife, if you like, which what vivisectors are good at. National coverage of the trial actually meant that Coleridge had enough to pay the fine. You still go for experiments, of course, from the general public. That's where they got the money, and he even had some amount for the NAV's funds on top of that. The Daily News declared that the trial was a miscarriage of justice, and the Times said that the behavior of the students in the public gallery was amount to medical hooliganism, hooligans with a dodgy set of morals. Now that's actually a quote, but it seems a very modern thing to say, a dodgy set of morals. So within 2 days of the verdict, Louisa Woodward approached Lizzie Lind with the idea of erecting a statue to the dog with fountains on 2 levels. This was a very kind of popular model at the time, and you'll see what it looks like. Essentially, it was a fountain for humans, and then there was a trough for horses, and then a lower trough for dogs. So these were very kind of popular at the time. And so to cut this part of the story, which is quite long, about how the actual statue came about, it ended up that Battersea Council eventually accepted the idea of the brown dog statue. And there it is in its kind of glory, if you like. Now, one thing about Battersea is it was a kind of an area of radicalism in those days. For example, William Wilberforce, the anti-slavery and anti-vivisection campaigner, lived there. It was also the location of the Battersea Dogs Home. And also it had a People's University, a polytechnic, which was set up to give working class people the chance of higher education or vocational qualifications. Now that was pretty radical in those days. And also it was a location of the Battersea General Hospital. And that was known as the Anti-Vivisection Hospital, or the Anti-Viv, and sometimes the Old Anti, it was called. So the Anti-Viv, the hospital, had a strict anti-vivisection policy, and they would not employ doctors who had vivisected. Now, the vivisectors, for their part, had been trying to defund this hospital for years, but public donations had kept it going. Battersea was also known for being the home of militant trade unionism and other progressive tendencies, not least women's suffrage. In fact, in some accounts, it is claimed that the medical students who were planning attacks on any statue that was built were able to mobilize anti-feminist feelings to swell their ranks. So this is a bit of a little mini timeline here. You've got 11th of July, 1906. Battersea Council give the go-ahead for the fountain. By September the 11th, the memorial was unveiled, and one account kind of implies that George Bernard Shaw was there. Other accounts actually say that he definitely was. However, most attendees, and this is really quite significant, were from a local working class council estate, which was called the Latchmere Council Estate. And that was close to the monument. And it turned out that that was very lucky that it was close to the monument because of subsequent events. The inscription on the original statue said, "In memory of the brown terrier dog done to death in the laboratories of University College in February 1903. So you can imagine the college wasn't too happy to have that prominently on display in public. After having endured vivisection extending over more than 2 months and having been handed over from one vivisector to another till death came to his release. Also the memory of the 232 dogs vivisected at the same place during the year 1902. Men and women of England, how long shall these things be?" Which is quite a stirring end for the inscription. So when we get to November the 20th of 1907, the medical students mount their first attack on the statue, and it actually became a really kind of focal point for a real battle. The police in the end had to mount 24-hour defense of the statue against the medical students. So a student called Howard Lister led the first attack on the fountain. 10 people were arrested. And then subsequently, over months later, really, or weeks at least, the statue is attacked with hammers and sledgehammers on a regular basis. Often students were found in the area of the statue with hidden weaponry, including hammers and all this kind of stuff. November the 22nd, 1907, medical students burn an effigy in central London. And they had switched, if you like, to central London because the fountain was now increasingly being defended by the police and the working class locals from the Latchmere estate. So on December the 10th, 1907, the medical students riot in Trafalgar Square. So they take part in a full-scale riot. I mean, when we think about violence in relation to, what you might call the animal advocacy movement, we tend to think of it on our side, and that's what's always said. But the first people to riot in this situation were the medical students. 12 of them are arrested. Now, Edward Ford, the guy who subsequently wrote the book, said he got caught up in all this and almost carried along the street by the mob. And he wrote down the students' so-called war song, which was sung to the tune of the Little Brown Jug. So if anybody knows that, you'll know how this goes. As we go walking after dark, we turn our steps to Latchmere Park, and there we see, to our surprise, a little brown dog that stands and lies. Ha ha ha, he, little brown dog. So that's the tune, right? I'm not going to sing it for you. How we hate thee, ha ha ha, he, little brown dog. How we hate thee. If we had a dog which told such fibs, we'd play a whip about his ribs. To tan him, we would not fail for carrying such a monstrous tail. Then you've got the chorus again. Little brown dogs may sit and beg, but they must not pull the public's leg. And if put-up stories shock the town, the authorities ought to pull them down. And then you've got the thing again. Now, this bit's quite interesting. It's a little bit Dick Van Dyke, really. Ford manages to get away from the mob, and he finds himself stood next to a police officer. Now, you might not be able to see this too well. Let me just see if I can make it a little bit bigger. And so the police officer explains to Ford what was going on. "It's only them brown doggers, sir. They're riled up because their professor did something to a dog, what's called vivispection. And the ladies, they stuck up a monument to the dog in Battersea, and they say it was tortured and that the professor, he broke the law. And them young gentlemen says it's a shame. And now the fat's in the fire, sir. And what do you think will happen? This is Ford asking the copper. Will the ladies or the students get the best of it? Well, sir, I'm thinking the ladies will. For that vivispection seems to me an ugly business. And if the young gents smash up the dog, as they are trying, I reckon the ladies will pretty soon stick it up again. So this is the police officer's rather, as I said, Dick Van Dyke account of what was kind of going on. So now we have a whole series of public meetings. December the 11th, 1907, anti-vivisection meeting at Acton Central Hall. This is disrupted by medical students. They have firecrackers, they have rattles, and even trumpets. So at this point, there's a whole series of town hall meetings going on, and many of them were disrupted by the medical students. And sometimes, as well as the police, as many as 300 stewards were employed to keep order. And then a contingent of working men were seen going into the meetings on a regular basis, and they swiftly and fairly violently dealt with any student protest. The anti-vivisectionists called them sympathetic working men, whereas one newspaper labeled them an army of unemployed thugs. So there was this continuous battle going on about this statue. By January the 8th, 1908, concerns were raised within the Battersea Council now about the policing costs of protecting the fountain. By February the 6th, 1908, questions in Parliament about the memorial were asked, not least again because of all the cost of it going on. November the 8th, 1909, medical student Arthur Allen was arrested trying to bribe a police officer. So the story is that he sidled up to a police officer and said he would give him some money if he would kind of just go for a bit of a stroll for a few minutes. And he was arrested and found to be equipped with heavy lump hammers and this kind of stuff. December the 8th, 1909, the council votes to change the inscription, which was infuriating the medical students. February the 9th, 1910 now, the council vote to return the fountain from whence it came, as it were. And then by March the 9th, 1910, the council vote to dismantle the memorial. And so we get then March the 10th, 1910, council workers take down the fountain as the police look on. March the 18th, 1910, there's another protest in Trafalgar Square, but this time it's to bring the fountain back as opposed to wanting it to be destroyed. January the 29th, 1911, at this stage, Louisa Woodward attempts to get the courts to demand the fountain's reinstatement, but she was unsuccessful in that. And then within days of this ruling, the fountain is reported to have been destroyed. So as suggested then, during the Brown Dog affair, local residents from the council estates would join the police to guard the statue. When the medical students attacked, they would pelt them with mud and stones and engage in what was called fisticuffs at that time. When one medical student was injured, for example, other students attempted to take him to the anti-viv hospital, but the locals barred the way, preventing the medical students from entry. So as we can see, there's a heck of a lot going on over this statue. And so we jump now to the 1980s. And I'm on the committee, 1982 now, of the British Union for the Abolition of Vivisection. And Dave McCall, who was the European Director of Sea Shepherd Conservation Society at the time. He was also on the committee. And Dave and I were not particularly interested in resurrecting the statue, but most of the executive committee were. And so they proceeded with the idea of getting another statue. The funding would come from the NAVs and the BWV, British Union for the Abolition of Vivisection, public funds, and some money, I believe, from Animal Aid, but I'm not sure about that. The first proposed sculptor, who was called Dame Elizabeth Frink, was rejected when it was discovered that she was famous for wearing big fur coats. And so a Nicola Hicks was commissioned to create the second statue. These meetings that went on in the committee that Dave and I was at, they dragged on and on and on, and eventually Dave McCall lost his temper because the argument between the parties involved with the funding was the pose which the dog would be depicted in. And so should he be lying? Should he be stood? Should he be sat? And this kind of stuff. And eventually McCall just lost his temper and said, I don't give a monkey's kind of thing. Just get it done. And so eventually they do, but it takes a while. And in December of 1985, the new monument is unveiled. And here he is, not as grand as the first, I think you'll agree, but does have some new inscriptions as well as the old one as well. In fact, there's 4 plaques altogether. These are just the 2. The third one is about who funded it, and the 4th one is the original inscription. The first plaque says, "This monument replaces the original memorial to the brown dog erected by public subscriptions in Latchmere Recreation Grounds, Battersea in 1906. The sufferings of, I think you should say, the brown dog at the hands of vivisectors generated much protest and mass demonstrations. It represented the revulsion of the people of London to vivisection and animal experimentation. This new monument is dedicated to the continuing struggle to end these practices. After much controversy, the former monument was removed in the early hours of the 10th of March, 1910. This was a result of a decision taken by the then Battersea Metropolitan Borough Council, the previous council having supported the erection of the memorial. There was a heck of a lot of politics, which I've kind of skipped over, to be honest. Plaque 2, which you may have difficulty seeing, apologies for that, especially if you're on a phone or something. Plaque 2 says, animal experimentation is one of the greatest moral issues of our time and should have no place in a civilized society, which George Bernard Shaw would agree with. In 1903, 19,000 animals suffered and died in British laboratories. During 1984, 3.5 million experiments were performed on live animals in Great Britain. Today, animals are burned, blinded, irradiated, poisoned, and subject to countless other horrifying experiments in Great Britain. So that's the 2, as it were, new plaques. The third one, as I said, being the being who funded it, and so on, and the 4th one being the actual original inscription, which was still there. So the statue is back, but when we moved to 1992, the Battersea Park new owners, which are called Wandsworth Council, they removed the statue again. And then by 1994, there's a big campaign by anti-vivisectionists, and the statue is returned into what is described as a much more secluded area. So I'm going to show you Google Maps. Now, ignore this. This is just actually the school where Donald Watson went to school, and there's a plaque of him. But that's not obviously what we're at today. So I was just that in. So if I put Battersea Park, London. So this is what the actual mappy bit looks like. And you can see the bandstand there, and it actually says the brown dog statue. Okay, so if we put our little man down here, the problem is that there's no sign of the statue, because you have to kind of go down one of these little laneways and then turn to find it. And so there's no, you know, so if you walk along the street and you're glancing down these passageways, you wouldn't see the statue. In fact, it's rather about, yeah, if we just turn, it's rather about there, but on a connecting way. So if we put this then into thing, so here we have the brown dog statue, and as you can see, it is rather secluded in the sense that you can't really see it. So that's where it is today. Secluded indeed. Now, just to finish off, we've got one more bit to go back to with regard to this, which is that there's a new campaign. So in 2021, an author called Paula S. Owen decided that she wanted to recast the fountain. And this is a picture of her with a model of the original, which she seems to have had. She seems to have had the look of having a car with a sunroof big enough to take this statue. And so they put the thing back in Battersea Park, and there's been a campaign ever since to try to get the original with the original inscriptions, of course, back. But I haven't been able to find out any success or how it's going or anything. But I mean, it's essentially been going 2 years, but I don't really know. To the left there, that's Paula S. Owen's novel, which she wrote about the book. And I just thought I'd finish with that because it's quite interesting. She says, let's get rid of that. The issue, she recounts, became a lightning rod for continuing disturbances, riots, and rallies across London. The statue was subjected to repeated attacks by outraged medical students, and it was defended by the equally outraged working-class locals of Battersea, plus a cast list of feminists, suffragists and suffragettes, trade unionists, radical liberals, and anarchists. The situation became a national talking point and was debated in Parliament. The statue was protected at great expense day and night by the police, which is a pretty neat summary to what went on. And that's your time tunnel, the brown dog affair. As I said, there's a heck of a lot of material about this that you can find, including the books that I've talked about. And if you just put in the little brown dog or the little brown dog affair, you'll find it. Did they purposely? Yes, that's what the BOAV and the NAVs think. Yeah, the sense that, in fact, I think Owen says in another part of her book that it's kind of so out of the way it's not going to cause any problems now. I think they said something like that, and so that actually might be one reason why this one won't come back, because I think the idea is to put it back where it was, and so I think the chances of that happening are probably non-existent. I would think, and of course they're just going to say, well, you've already got one, but again. As we can see with this in this area that you just essentially can't see. And so really the only people who go to visit the statue now, I think, are people who know it's there. And you would have to be kind of lucky to kind of find it. Although it is in the actual Google Maps, so it does mark it in that. So in that sense, yes, you're right. It's still as controversial as ever, but I suppose they're trying to I suppose they're trying to stop a recurrence of the actual fighting that went on. Whether medical students would have, you see, it was very immediate back then, and it just been a big controversial trial, etc., etc. And so, in that sense, you could see why the medical students were riled up. It was also a time when they were worried about their reputation. And it was also the time when the anti-vivisection movement was really strong. In fact, most of the campaigning that was going on was either anti-vivisection or possibly anti-blood sports at the same time, although the League Against Cruel Sports didn't exist until about 1925, I believe. When I got involved with the movement in 1979, it was blood sports. It was an anti-battery cage campaign going on, which was led by compassionate wool farming, which was started by a dairy farmer in 1967, and also then the anti-vivisectionists, which accounts for the fact that when I got involved with the movement, the first thing I did was go sabbing, and then when I got involved with the larger movement, the first thing I did was get involved with anti-vivisection. So that was the big thing. As we say, and as Ronnie Lee and I say on our sister program, Still Alive, we were all, or the people we knew anyway, were all vegans at the time, but we didn't campaign for veganism. It wasn't as it is now, which obviously is a big shame. It would be remarkable to wonder what would happen if, it had been vivisection as the moral baseline in the 1970s, which would be quite interesting. We might be further on, as it were, than we are now, but it doesn't know. Joanna, unfair. This means that we have a long way to end experiments on animals, just as the Tories just continue to test. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so we've got this. What they've kind of gone back on a 25-year ban on cosmetics, and I think the anti-vivisectionists always thought that the cosmetic ban would be guaranteed to succeed, because who's going to defend it, right? And that's why they kind of separated it out from the medical experiments, so-called, and so that's why they became very controversial within the movement too, as well, because the more abolitionist people didn't want to make such a separation. They wanted to talk about animal experiments across the board, but the moderates won out, in fact, to the extent that the BUAV, British Union for the Abolition of Vivisection, became cruelty-free international, and cruelty-free is the phrase that is mainly associated with products and shampoos, that kind of stuff. So the privileged students were against animal rights, and the workers and less privileged echelons of society were for the other animals. Yes, opposite of what vegans are now accused. Yeah, that's right. It's really kind of interesting. This time tunnel is really interesting in that sense. Also, the idea that there was an anti-vivisection hospital, right next to a polytechnic, and the working class were supportive of that. The hospital depended on public funds, and then they also had this thing about some of the first education facilities for the working class, which became the polytechnic system, I suppose. And that then became, later, I think, 80s, 90s, all the British polytechnics became other types of universities. So, for example, there used to be a Liverpool University when I was there, and also a Liverpool Polytechnic when I was there, and now there's two universities. So, yeah, so politically, it's really interesting, and the fact that anti-vivisection and the kind of the intertwining of all these justice issues, within Battersea is really kind of fascinating part of the story. Right? I must admit. So, well, this has been one of the longer time tunnels. So, thank you for bearing with us, people. And if everybody, I think we've had a bit of smashing going on Facebook. So, thanks for that. I forgot to put. I don't know whether was this one put up. I can't remember. Was that one put up? Because I always like to remind people that on this channel we will never ever charge vegans to talk to us, because I think that is pretty despicable, to be quite honest. Okay, people, thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time on a vegan time tunnel, the subject of which at the present I don't know, but it'll be there. See you next week.